Ruby was actually born in Mississippi, and Carl was the second child. Then Mary was 3 months old when we went to New Orleans. So we decided to leave so we could make it better, you know. Ruby had to take a test. It was 165 children that took the test. Just 5 kids passed the test. And so Ruby was one of the ones. I wanted it better for my kids, and it was for us, so we could go to school and learn, get our education. But before the integration started, we had to go to the superintendent's Redmond. So we had to go to his office, and he explained to me and my husband that we was praying peoples, and we had to pray because things were gonna get really worse. Because when we drove up right by the school, they had so many United States Marshals, so many people just standing, screaming and hollering, and 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't want to integrate, 2, 4, 6, 8, you know, just carry that needle away, and just every kind of thing they were saying, you know. But we just got out and started pitching eggs and tomatoes and everything. And but they didn't hit us because the marshals really took care. And when we walked to the step, when we got to the step, they had city policemen, and they says, you cannot come in. And 2 of the marshals said, the United States, the president said we can. Later on, one of the city policemen was arrested because he pulled his gun to shoot. And everybody said they knew probably to kill me, says if they killed the mother, the child wouldn't have went. So, but they wouldn't let us know that until later. And so we got in the car and started home. So many people got in the car and just followed us. And when they followed us home, they started pitching bottles and things. And all our neighbors was at the corner because they had a bar right on the corner. They had bottles, bricks, and things. They was throwing them back. So what they did is just call in United States Marshals in each car. Then they had a machine gun beside the guns they had. And that's the way we lived it for a whole year. And I just think it is a good thing to let people know what you did. And you know, it's really just something that we couldn't get my education, so I just really wanted other people to know how hard it was. Study, listen to what the teachers tell them and their mothers and fathers, and after they get their education, they could be any person they wanted to be, doctors, lawyers, or anything, but you have to have that education. And I would love for them to just listen to my stories so they can know how hard it was for my kids to go to school. Like all those peoples and things calling us names and things, you just have to charge that to their ignorance and just go on, be yourself, and go on, and God will bring you through. That's when I tell them, I'm just as proud of anybody else's children as I am mine for getting their education, because I feel like I still did something that other people's children can, know what I did means something.
Amen. As we continue with the Hidden Figure series that our pastor has created, we have a hidden figure today in Lucille Bridges. And as we go to the Word of God, I believe God's going to show us some things, even for us, even now. And so I give honor and thanks and praise to God for this preaching moment. Thank God for my pastor who allowed to yield the pulpit in his absence, to my First Lady, to all of you, our ministers, our deacons, our trustees, all of our family and friends, the Third Baptist Church of Chicago. Y'all, it is preaching time. Amen. It is preaching time. And I will read the text for your hearing today, which comes from Exodus 2, 1 through 10. Feel free to stand. We are reading from the NRSVUE version. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine boy, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the banks of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and while her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying, and she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrews' children, she said. And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it. And when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. For your hearing today, I've coined this sermon, it's worth the risk. It's worth the risk. You may be seated in the presence of the Lord. It is worth the risk. The cultural and political climate of the world is often the driving force behind our decision making. We make choices and or we make changes in our movement because of what's going on in the world. We base our decision making on what we've learned about or what we've heard about or even what we've seen with our own eyes. We've lived through these different experiences in cultural climate, and we've all experienced some of them together. We've all lived through recent days, on a global scale, where we've had to literally change the very existence as we knew it. A virus broke out, and we changed our movement drastically. We changed the way we do work and conduct business. We changed the way we engage socially. And most importantly, we changed the way we worship. We changed the way we engage with the people and with the house of God. We shifted to virtual platforms for communication. We decided to wear masks when around others. And we increased our vitamin intake and or we got vaccinated. That's what we do. We make decisions based on the climate of the world. We consider who's in office, their prejudices or their capacity for equity, their implicit biases or their cultural sensitivities. Most people make decisions based on the climate of the world. And we're no different. We make decisions regarding our movement for self-preservation. Someone say self-preservation. Self-preservation. We make these movements. In essence, we make decisions to keep ourselves safe. We make decisions to secure our futures. And we make these decisions to preserve our lives. It's true now. It was true then, as we saw in the video. And it's true in the biblical age as well. And we see that in the story of Exodus. Today's hidden figure points out something very clear that we all need to grasp hold today. And as we think about today's hidden figure, there's another hidden figure tucked in the book of Exodus that we want to pull out and parallel the two stories together. In Exodus 1, the king of that day, Pharaoh, publicly acknowledged the significant growth of the Hebrew people. Pharaoh said, there's too many of them. They are growing increasingly. They are waxing strong. They are strong within their right, within their power. They are a strong people. Sooner or later, they will overtake us. And so then Pharaoh decides, and he grabs his people and his armies, and he gets the people of Egypt together and says that the Hebrew boys must die. Kill all the newborn Hebrew boys. They all must die. And we see in the text that Pharaoh makes this decree to kill all the Hebrew boys, and suddenly these boys have a target on their backs. Fasting forward to chapter 2, this Hebrew woman had a baby, and because it was a boy, he had a target on his back. And she had this baby boy, and somehow he managed to escape death. But we realized that it was because the mother had a vision for the future. She had a vision for the future, and this child that I'm speaking of, we know him well. His name is Moses. And though we've heard the story of Moses told in Sunday school and vacation Bible school and from pulpits near and far, we rarely heard the story of his mother. The mother who made the sacrifice that she would put her son on the front line for things yet unknown. The mother who decided that she would shift the narrative and take matters into her own hand. The mother who decided that she would do the unthinkable. The story of this mother, this biblical hidden figure, though acknowledged in the text, she's nameless. Nameless in the text. There's no record of her name recorded anywhere in the text. And for that reason alone, one might say that her story is an insignificant one to the Bible. It's an insignificant story that we really don't have to pay much attention to. But I like to suggest today that her story, though rarely recognized and minimally publicized, it's still a story that we need to elevate today. She's a Hebrew woman living in Egypt. And though the Bible doesn't name her, according to the Jewish Women's Archive, her name is Jochebed. She had a child who, according to the cultural climate of that time, was destined to die. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? As we think about our black children that leave the house, and we think about what they have to engage with as they make their way down the street and make their way to school and make their way to their jobs, as we think about what our black children have to go through as they step into the unknown, as they leave our homes, as we think about what our black children have to go through, I'm reminded of what this nameless woman in the Bible had to go through. Today, we give her life, we give her story voice. Her name is Jochebed. Jochebed's situation was one that's no different than ours. In the eyes of the officials, the child she delivered had an expiration date. And can you imagine the emotions she must have felt daily? Anxiety, fear, worry about what would come. She was connected to him. This was her child. And according to Exodus chapter 2, verse 2, when she had this child, right away she saw him. She looked upon him and recognized that he was a fine baby. And she immediately knew what she had. She looked upon her son and she saw him. And the original Hebrew phrase for this is that she inspected him and she perceived or considered. And once she inspected him and perceived or considered what he might be, she paid close attention to him and she saw that he was good, pleasant, and agreeable. And so she hid him away. In essence, she knew that she could preserve his life because she paid attention to his temperament. She could see what he was made of. The word says that she watched him, she paid attention and noticed that he was a good baby. In that good baby, meaning that he was reasonable, he could listen, he didn't cry a lot. She saw him, she noticed him, and then she hid him. She realized what he was made of. And I wonder how many of us can say we've taken the time with ourselves and we've examined ourselves and we now see what we're made of. I wonder how many of us will examine our children, take the time to look at them closely and see what they are made of. Regardless of what society says about them, regardless of what society calls them, regardless of the X that's on their back, I want to know, is there anybody in the room that's willing to look at our children and pull them from the crevices of the enemy's hand and say, I can see what you are made of? She saw what he was made of. And there are many of us who don't take the time to see what we're made of. We easily have expectations of people, but how many of us actually take the time to pay attention to see what we're made of and what we're capable of? See, Jochebed saw her son and learned that he was good. From her perspective, he had what it took to make it. So instead of letting him leave the house for fear that he never returned to the house, she hid him away in the house. In the Hebrew culture, if you had a son, your future was secured. In that day, women had no acknowledged capital within themselves. They were not valued for the contributions to civilization or their abilities to create wealth and prosperity. Without a man, there was no hope for a future. So having a son meant that you would always have someone to provide for you or to take care of you. And according to the culture, Moses was the very best of her. According to the culture, Moses was the best part of her. Can you imagine having to hide the best part of you? Can you imagine having to tuck the very essence of yourself away in the crevices of your soul where nobody truly gets to know the cultural capital that you hold? Can you imagine having to hide yourself? Hide the very best of yourself. And she had to hide the very best of herself. And there are times when we have to hide the very best of ourselves. Sometimes we choose to hide the best of ourselves of fear that someone might take it away or exploit us. And then there are other times when we hide the best of ourselves because we're asked to hide so that we don't intimidate anybody else. But since it's Black History Month, let's talk about it. We're asked to hide the best parts of ourselves daily when they make our white counterparts uncomfortable, or when we show the best parts of ourselves and we show up as a threat. Sometimes we are asked to hide the best parts of ourselves. We're asked to hide or silence our voices through the banning of the books in Florida, and we hide the best part of ourselves through those brutal stories as we show our resilience. The best part of ourselves are ignored when the Supreme Court decides that affirmative action is no longer important, and when affirmative action's sole goal was to find the hidden gems of intellectual capital tucked away in poor Black people in small towns that otherwise would have no access to education. All I'm trying to say is, people of God, sometimes we are asked to hide ourselves. The best part of ourselves. We're asked to ignore ourselves. We're asked to silence ourselves. We're asked to shrink ourselves. But there comes a time in life when you can no longer hide or ignore the best parts of you. And you've got to take some risks. Tell your neighbor, you got to take some risks. You got to take some risks. Exodus 2:3, she says she hid him away for 3 months. The Bible says she hid him away for 3 months. I was thinking maybe she had hope for a future. Or maybe she lived day by day as she wrestled with the reality that it could all end at any moment. My child could die at any moment. My child could walk out any moment. Do we wrestle with it? We wrestle with these things that it can all be taken away from us at any moment. Has anybody ever felt that way? That things could shift in any moment. Something good happens in your life, or there's a moment of hope, and you realize that it could all end in any moment. Oftentimes, we think it could all end at any moment because we've had to hide the best parts of ourselves for too long. That imposter syndrome starts kicking in, and we start thinking, what if I'm not good enough? We start thinking, what if it doesn't work out for me? We start thinking, what if I can't make it? What if I'm not strong enough and I can't take it? We spend more time worrying about what isn't right, and the best parts of us go neglected or remain hidden in plain sight. I imagine this is what Jochebed had to go through. The worrying, the fighting in her mind, the wrestling. But I believe she knew that she couldn't hide the best part of her forever. And the same is true for us today, that we can't contain our blackness forever. That we can't accept people ignoring our cultural capital and what we bring to the table forever. Just like Jochebed couldn't be bound by the cultural climate of her day, we cannot be bound by the cultural climate of our day. So we have some decisions to make. And we see it in the text that not only did she have some decisions to make, she had some risks to take. And the same was true for our hidden figure today, Lucille Bridges. Many of you have heard the story of her daughter, Ruby Bridges, but very few have heard the story of the mother. The cultural climate of her time was segregation. The superiority complex of white people in our nation's recognized leaders insisted that segregation would be the way of life. Though black people did the same thing as white people, they couldn't do it with them. And similar to the story of Jochebed, the children had targets on their backs. Black kids play just like white kids play. Why can't they do it together? Black kids learn just like white kids learn. Why can't they do it together? The leaders of that day knew that if they could keep the children from reaching their fullest potential, they would keep the adults from doing the same. And don't you know that the same is true for us today? That if we lose our children, there is no hope for our future. If we don't grab our children close now, there is no hope for our future. The same was true for Jochebed, and the same was true for Lucille as well. So we see that Lucille had decided that she was going to take some risks. So this is the climate of Lucille's story. And as it unfolds, we dig a little bit deeper to learn a little bit more about who Lucille really is. Born to sharecroppers, she too became a sharecropper with nothing more than an 8th grade education. She later married and had children of her own, and there are records of her saying that though she didn't have one, she believed in the value of an education. By 1954, the political climate had begun to shift, and the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously decided in Brown versus Board of Education that school segregation was unconstitutional. And though the Supreme Court deemed it unconstitutional, those living in segregated cities couldn't fathom the change. Similar to Jochebed and similar to us today, Lucille suddenly had some decisions to make and some risks to take. She saw her daughter and knew that she was capable. She saw her daughter and she was not willing to hide her daughter. You all saw the story. She placed her daughter in the middle of the front line. She took a test. She passed the test, and she was the first black child to desegregate a school. She saw her daughter. She knew what her daughter was capable of. She saw her daughter's worth, and she took a risk. But truth be told, we as people don't want to take risks. Yeah, taking risk is defined as doing something although there is a chance of a bad result or the possibility of danger, defeat, or loss. But I've come to tell you today that you have got to be willing to take some risks. And all risks are not guaranteed to end in loss. You've got to be willing to count the cost. If there's more to gain than there is to lose, even if there's a potentiality for great loss, people of God, it's worth the cost. It's worth the cost. Both Jochebed and Lucille decided that there was more to gain by taking the risk than by staying where they were. And according to Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, Jochebed decided to put her son in the river to give him a shot at a better life. And we see that Lucille decided to put her child on the front line to give her a shot at a better life. As a result of the decision making for Jochebed, we see in the rest of our focal verses that her son was found by Pharaoh's daughter. His life was spared. Jochebed got to nurse him and take care of him until he was of age. Y'all, my how the tables turn when we decide to take a few risks. My how things start to shift in our favor when we decide that we're going to take a few risks. My how things start to look a little bit differently when we just decide to step out there and take some risks. The same was true for Lucille. Her and her family later relocated from Mississippi to New Orleans. And in 1956, to give her children an opportunity that she did not have, as a result in moving, by 1960, her daughter was the first black child to integrate a segregated school, affording her access to a better education. My, how tables turn when we decide to take risks. So she took the risk, and we see just how the tables turn when we take risks. So the risk was great for both women, but the reward was greater. The risk was great for Lucille. It was not without cost. Her life was threatened. She was verbally and physically assaulted every single day as she walked her daughter to school. The risk was great, and it came at a great cost. But she also benefited greatly, and it wouldn't have been so without a great risk. If we read the rest of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, we see that Jochebed's risk ended in great reward as well. We see that Moses becomes this leader who leads the children of Israel out of slavery. And if you follow black history, you will see that Lucille's risk also came into a fruition for the masses, that it desegregated school systems, affording all black people with great access to quality education. Their risks sustained their people. And church, if we're going to sustain ourselves, we too have got to acknowledge that we've got to take some risks. If we are going to have a hope for a future, and if our children are going to have a hope for a future, we have got to take some risks. As we serve as the church, we must open our eyes to see, just like Jochebed did and just like Lucille did, open our eyes to see that we've got some goodness in us. We got to open our eyes to see ourselves, and we got to open our eyes to see others as well. Our children are suffering. Our communities are suffering. And what are we doing about it? If we truly examine our situation, we'll see that our lack in taking great risks has kept us stagnant. We'll see that we're 3 generations behind. We'll see that millennials ranging from 30 to 44 are leaving the church in massive numbers. We see that generational Z, ranging from 11 to 29, have minimal regard for the church at all. And we'll see that the larger percentage of Generation Alpha, ages 1 through 11, have never even stepped foot into a church one day in their lives. Church, if we're going to sustain ourselves and live and see our futures and help our people to live, then we've got to make some decisions based on the church's cultural climate, and we've got to take some risks. We've got to try some new things. We've got to stretch ourselves and expand our minds. And it may come with its challenges, but we've still got to take some risks. And I want to know today, is there anybody in the room that's willing to take some risks? Do I have some risk takers in the room today or watching virtually? Is there anybody willing to push the envelope just a little bit? Is there anybody willing to push the needle just a little bit to move some things forward? Is there anybody willing to stir the pot a little bit? Is there anybody willing to take some risks? The word says that, behold, I'm getting ready to do a new thing. And I need to know, Third Baptist Church of Chicago, are we ready for God to do the new thing in us? Are we ready for God to stretch us beyond measure? Are we ready to see God open up doors that have yet to be opened for our people? Are we ready to see God shift some things and shift the climate? Are we ready to see God do a new thing on the inside of us? Are we ready? We've got to take some risks, church. And though the risk may be great, there is good news. Somebody say there is good news. There's good news. The reward is greater, and we don't have to do it alone. Amen. The reward is greater. We don't have to do it alone. The final piece of context I want to share with you is that Jochebed was a woman of faith, and Lucille was a woman of faith. And church, the last time I checked, we were a people of faith. And if God can be present with Jochebed, if God could be present with Lucille, then I believe God can be present with you, and God can be present with me. I believe God can be present with this church as we decide to take some risk. Listen, the God we serve is the ultimate risk taker. I know a God who sent his son down into this earth, and his name was Jesus. And Jesus was the ultimate risk taker. He decided to show up to this earth and take the ultimate risk. He decided to show up before the Sadducees and the Pharisees. That was a risk. He decided to preach a new gospel. That was a risk. And he decided to die for you and me. That was a risk. He took nails in his hands. That surely was a risk. He took nails in his feet. I'm telling you, that was a risk. And he's still taking a risk on us right now. He woke you up this morning. That was a risk. He started you on your way. That was a risk. He believed that you would do the impossible. He's taking a risk on you even now. People of God, we have risk-taking in our blood. We have risk-taking in our blood. When did we become so afraid? When did we decide that we were not who God called us to be? When did we decide that we could not pull people from the margins? When did the church decide that they wanted to push people further out into the margins? When did we decide that we'd stop feeding people, that we'd stop clothing people, that we'd stop praying for people, that we'd stop loving people unconditionally? When did we decide that? People of God, if we are going to sustain ourselves as the people of God, we've got to be willing to take some risks. And I'm here to tell you it is worth it. It's worth the risk.